Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you've been watching the news cycle wrap up the year 2025 and felt a sense of chaotic, almost overwhelming convergence.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. It feels like the military escalation in Europe is meeting these terrifying economic warnings, all set against a backdrop of deep internal political turmoil right here in Washington. You are not alone if you feel like we are at a real inflection point.
That feeling of convergence is exactly what we need to unpack. Our mission today is highly specific. We want to act as your expert guide through the really volatile news reports that spanned December 27th to the 29th, 2025.
And we've pulled a lot of material for this.
We have a stack of sources, primarily deep dive YouTube transcripts that, they go far beyond the headlines. They cover detailed military analysis, behind the scenes diplomatic maneuvering, and some pretty stark warnings about resource warfare.
Right, and we're not here to just summarize the news. We're here to distill the underlying realities, the systemic connections that, frankly, the mainstream narratives often ignore.
We're connecting the dots.
Exactly. Connecting the dots between the accelerating conflict in Ukraine, the major policy shifts happening in U.S. foreign policy, and this emerging economic warfare that, it threatens the Western industrial base itself. It's a complex, multi-layered crisis. But let's jump right into the deepest crack. The dramatic escalation on the Ukrainian front.
Okay, let's do it.
So we have to start with what seems to be the most dramatic event of this period, which is this massive claimed drone attack deep inside Russia.
Indeed. We're talking about something unprecedented. Russian officials asserted that on December 28th and 29th, 2025, Ukraine launched a colossal swarm of long-range drones.
And what was the number they were citing?
The specific count was 90 to 91, a huge number. And the target wasn't, a tactical strike on a military depot. This was a direct strategic attack aimed at President Putin's official residence in Novgorod.
Aimed at the head of state.
Directly at the head of state. That's the message.
So the immediate and, I guess, predictable reaction from Moscow was explosive.
Oh, absolutely. Foreign Minister Lavrov vowed serious, maybe even disproportionate retaliation. He labeled them reckless actions that simply would not go unanswered.
But there is a really important caveat here, right? Because Russia also maintained that every single one of those 91 drones was intercepted.
That's the other side of the coin. They claim no damage was done, all intercepted. And that's where the fog of war, it descends.
Because the Ukrainian side, through President Zelensky, just immediately and completely dismissed the reports.
Called them typical Russian lies manufactured for propaganda purposes. That was the official line from Kiev.
Okay, so here we have this huge event that may or may not have happened exactly as described, but does that even matter?
Well, that's the thing. Regardless of whether the drones hit their target or even whether the number is accurate, the sheer claim itself fundamentally shifts the context of escalation.
This is where it gets particularly crucial for you, the listener, to focus. The analysis that we've seen immediately suggested that launching 91 long-range drones requires a level of planning, coordination, and targeting intelligence that Ukraine simply doesn't possess on its own.
Not at that scale, no. It implies significant, likely American Western intelligence support and deep logistical coordination.
Which leads to one particular perspective on this.
Right. One perspective argues that this massive, very high-stakes move targeting what is widely regarded as Putin's ultimate red line, a direct threat to his life or his core leadership, was actually calculated. It was a move to pressure him into accepting a quick peace deal. The logic being, look, we can touch you, so negotiate now on our terms.
But if we examine the history of leadership in conflict, especially authoritarian ones, that kind of pressure tactic almost always backfires, doesn't it?
It almost always has the exact opposite effect. Threatening the life of the head of state doesn't lead to compromise. It hardens Russia's position, it eliminates any remaining desire for diplomatic off-ramps, and it dramatically increases the appetite for severe retaliation. It basically justifies maximum force.
And the timing of all this makes the story even more compelling.
It does, because Putin was reportedly informed of this massive drone attempt while he was on a scheduled call with President Trump.
Right in the middle of a call. And the diplomatic fallout was instantaneous.
Kremlin sources wasted no time. They were immediately reporting their version of Trump's reaction, claiming he was shocked, outraged, and called the attack insane.
Crucially, they added that this incident would definitely influence Washington's approach to the Zelensky government.
Yes, implying a loss of trust, maybe, or at least a willingness to to pull back on support for these high-risk escalatory actions.
But the most telling detail from that Kremlin leak, at least for me, was the claim that Trump was allegedly relieved that the U.S. had previously refrained from providing advanced long-range weapon systems.
Tomahawk cruise missiles specifically.
Tomahawk missiles. This is a massive tell.
It is. It suggests U.S. officials themselves fear a total loss of control over the conflict if Kyiv were given the means to strike deep into sensitive Russian command centers or, population areas. It really highlights a critical internal fracture within the U.S. policy apparatus about how far they trust or want to empower the current Ukrainian government.
And this drama, it just perfectly sets the stage for this wider diplomatic disconnect we're seeing.
It really does, because despite this profound escalation, President Trump was publicly claiming that peace talks were already 90 to 95% of the way there.
95%.
95% of the way to a peaceful settlement. He was focusing on a 20-point peace plan, security guarantees. He was minimizing the remaining obstacles, acknowledging only one or two tough, thorny issues.
Which everyone understands to be about territory.
Of course. It's about the ownership of the annexed regions.
Yeah.
That's the sticking point.
It just seems like a profound case of self-delusion or maybe strategic misdirection. Because what's fascinating here is the sheer fantasy embedded in the negotiation rhetoric coming from Kyiv.
Zelensky's demands, as they're repackaged in his 20-point plan, are seen by military and financial critics as completely, unaffordable and wildly unrealistic.
Let's look at two specifics.
Okay. First, he requested an unconditional 60-day ceasefire. The reason given was for an unexplained referendum.
Unexplained. Okay.
And second, and this is perhaps the most unrealistic part, was the request for an 800,000-man Ukrainian army.
An 800,000-man standing army. I mean, that's a force size that even major, wealthy European powers would struggle to sustain in peacetime.
Let alone a nation ravaged by war and suffering immense demographic loss. This army would require, unlimited, decades-long Western funding and supply commitments, far exceeding anything promised to date.
So the request itself signals a massive disconnect from actual financial and military reality.
Or perhaps it's designed to be rejected, thereby maintaining the moral high ground.
Meanwhile, Russia's position has only hardened through all this.
Dramatically. Putin, making a highly symbolic appearance in full military uniform, communicated non-negotiables that run directly counter to Zelensky's position and, frankly, Trump's optimism.
His position was crystal clear.
Absolutely. Donbas, Crimea, Zaporizhia, and Kherson must return to Russia in their entirety. He declared that the question of a negotiated troop withdrawal is, and this is a quote, practically reduced to zero.
So Russia intends to achieve its stated territorial aims militarily.
Which makes Trump's 95% peace claim feel completely meaningless.
And Russia's also interpreting this diplomatic back and forth as a sign of weakness in Washington.
They are. Sources note that Putin observed the U.S. backing away from earlier, potentially more favorable proposals like those discussed in Anchorage due to stiff European or Ukrainian pushback.
And what were those Anchorage proposals? We should clarify that.
They likely involved earlier iterations of peace talks where the U.S. might have been willing to pressure Ukraine into concessions, or a conflict-free is more favorable to Russia than the current front lines, all in exchange for avoiding further escalation.
But those proposals were walked back.
They were, due to lobbying from European capitals and from Kyiv. And so Moscow interpreted it as Washington lacking the internal discipline and coherence necessary to push through a settlement. It suggests the U.S. negotiating team doesn't truly speak for the entire American foreign policy establishment.
This raises a critical point about the security guarantee mirage. The Europeans are desperate for U.S.-backed Article 5-like security guarantees for Ukraine.
And we need to be clear about what that means. Article 5 is the core principle of NATO. An attack on one member is an attack on all.
So they want that promise, but without actual membership.
Correct. The Europeans want Kyiv to have a promise of defense that essentially mimics the core NATO commitment without the actual legal framework of NATO membership. Russia, however, insists that genuine security requires addressing a far more fundamental issue.
NATO's expansion.
NATO's continued expansion right up to their borders. They are pointing back to the foundational structural proposals Russia made in its 2021 draft treaty, which demanded a radical overhaul of the entire European security architecture.
A treaty the West completely ignored at the time.
Exactly. So Russia won't accept a vague promise of arms. They want a structural guarantee that their core security concerns are addressed.
So we have two sides speaking fundamentally different languages. Trump says peace is nearly done, while Russia is announcing, in military uniform no less, that they are no longer interested in negotiating territory because they are currently taking it on the ground.
And that's the critical contrast. The hopeful diplomatic rhetoric stands in stark opposition to the harsh reality on the ground, which signals that Russia is transitioning to a winning military solution.
The recent Russian advances have been rapid and highly significant.
Very. We're seeing the fall of several key strategic areas within a matter of days. Stepnogorsk, Guliapol, which fell in about a week, and then Mirnograd and Rudinska.
And critically, Russia has advanced 15 kilometers from the outskirts of Zaporizhia.
Right, which puts enormous pressure on major urban centers. The military conclusion is pretty much unavoidable at this point. Russia is currently winning.
Why? That's the key advantage.
They possess the necessary manpower and, crucially, the industrial capacity to sustain the war effort indefinitely. And they can do it mostly domestically. The tide shifted dramatically in 2025 because Russia effectively mobilized its defense industrial base. The West, relying on depleted stockpiles, simply cannot sustain the required rate of fire.
And this industrial self-sufficiency is Ukraine's Achilles heel.
It is. Without sustained, massive Western support, Ukraine cannot match Russia's material production, especially considering their limited reserve military forces.
So they're constantly forced to shift already strained troops to plug one hole in the front line.
While the Russians exploit that and accelerate attacks elsewhere. The Russian strategy now appears to be one of attrition, combined with continuous small-scale advances designed to maximize the resource drain on the Ukrainian side until they have to surrender.
This failure to produce a coherent winning strategy or even a rational peace deal, it feeds directly into a key concern raised in the source material.
Which is, who is actually driving U.S. foreign policy?
Exactly. Because even as Trump attempts to negotiate an end to the conflict, sources raise serious concerns about elements within the CIA pursuing an agenda independent of or even actively undermining Trump's orders.
That is an explosive claim. That a deep faction of the intelligence community, what some people call the deep state, is actively working to prolong a war the president ostensibly wants to end.
It speaks to a deep institutional division.
It does, and the sources cite a highly controversial anecdote to illustrate this. It involves a former CIA colleague, Susan Miller, who was part of the 1985 career trainee program. Her recent public statements illustrate this internal conflict perfectly.
Okay, so what were those statements?
Well, she has taken two highly contradictory public stances. On one hand, she made an extremely dark claim, basically confirming the most cynical suspicions about intelligence agency activities overseas. She stated that the CIA was actively working with groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Working with them.
That was the claim. But then on the other hand, she publicly claimed that she led the team that produced the legit intelligence assessment on Russian interference in the 2016 election.
The very assessment the figures like Tulsi Gabbard have repeatedly called completely bogus and politically motivated.
Exactly. It's a fascinating anecdote, but also extremely high stakes, and, it's sourced from an individual making these two very contradictory claims.
So if the sources are relying on a single former operative making these two claims, one confirming dark suspicions and the other reinforcing an official, politically convenient narrative, how do we, as analysts, evaluate the credibility of that specific evidence?
I think we should not accept the individual claims as fact, but rather recognize the pattern they illustrate. The sources use this example as evidence of a systemic effort. Whether Miller is being truthful or not, the pattern is clear. You have influential voices, often tied to the intelligence community, simultaneously confirming the existence of a rogue element in the CIA, the ISIS claim, while also aggressively reinforcing the very narrative, the 2016 Russian interference claim, that has continuously undermined Trump's legitimacy and complicated his diplomatic initiatives with Moscow.
So the implication is that even if Trump attempts to change course or pursue a rational end to the war, maybe because that drone attack scared him, there are powerful institutional elements working against those goals, complicating and sometimes countermanding his efforts.
Precisely. It creates a deeply fractured, almost schizophrenic U.S. foreign policy. The left hand doesn't know, or maybe doesn't care, what the right hand is doing.
And this internal chaos, it dramatically reduces American leverage and credibility on the global stage.
Which brings us to the next critical area. The true nature of global leverage in the 21st century.
That's a staggering amount of political and military chaos happening at once. But now we have to shift gears completely and look at how this kinetic warfare is rapidly giving way to resource warfare, which is arguably even more existential for the long-term viability of the U.S.
Yes. The transition from the conflict on the Ukrainian battlefield to the global economy reveals a fundamental and, I think, critical shift in power. There's a massive leverage disparity in Washington's foreign policy toolkit that most policymakers are only just starting to grasp.
So let's analyze this disparity. We can use two contrasting examples of U.S. leverage. First, look at Israel.
Right. Trump successfully exerted maximum pressure on Netanyahu in the past. Why?
Right.
Because Israel is fundamentally and functionally dependent on U.S. military resources, missiles, bombs, interceptors, and, of course, diplomatic cover at the UN.
Without that constant supply, their entire war machine would grind to a halt.
It would run dry in a very short period of time. That is the definition of powerful direct operational leverage. The U.S. has the ability to pull the plug on Israeli military action if it chooses.
However, the U.S. has no equivalent leverage over Russia.
None whatsoever. Russia's capacity to sustain the war is domestically driven. They have the manpower, they have the resources, and they've reactivated their industrial base. The historical U.S. toolkit of economic pressure, despite something like 14,000 sanctions, has spectacularly failed to cripple Moscow.
The sanctions just made things inconvenient for a while.
In the short term, yes. But in response, Moscow focused on domestic ingenuity and successfully inoculated its economy by finding alternative partners like China and India, often trading energy and commodities for finished goods and technology.
And the ruble was surprisingly resilient.
It was. Russia possesses the essential resources and, crucially, the industrial infrastructure to keep the war going indefinitely, even if its Chinese partners were to suddenly back out. This is the new economic reality Trump has to face.
Which leads us to this critical distinction that the sources emphasize, the difference between financial warfare and industrial warfare.
And this is so important. The U.S. has historically been the uncontested global champion of financial warfare. We control global credit, we freeze bank accounts, we weaponize the dollar.
That China is now dominating industrial warfare.
By controlling the stuff.
Yeah.
The critical resources, the raw materials, and the downstream processing necessary to make modern technology and military hardware function. It is a profound shift in power dynamics.
And this industrial power shift reveals the catastrophic, broken state of the U.S. defense industrial base. It's been rightly called the broken arsenal of democracy.
Because it is. It's unable to produce enough basic artillery shells, much less sophisticated systems like Patriot missiles, to meet the demands of even a major proxy conflict.
And the root cause is a systemic one, traced back over 4 decades.
It's financialization, it's factory closures, it's outsourcing driven by Wall Street's relentless pursuit of just-in-time efficiency and higher stock prices. The industrial heartland of the U.S. was sold off or dismantled because it was cheaper to have China process the materials.
And this brings us to the core technical vulnerability. The Pentagon is now realizing that the U.S. outsourced the processing of key raw materials to China, effectively exchanging short-term corporate profit for long-term national security.
We need to be specific about what materials we are talking about and why they matter so much.
Okay, let's break it down.
Let's start with gallium. Gallium is essential for high-frequency semiconductors used in TR modules for ASA radar systems.
And what does that mean in plain English?
ASA radars are the electronic brains of modern fighter jets, advanced surface-to-air missile batteries, and critical naval systems. So outsourcing gallium processing means China can potentially cripple the U.S.'s most advanced air defense and offense capabilities by simply turning off the spigot.
Wow. Okay, what's next?
Then there is germanium. This is vital for fiber optics, critical communications infrastructure, and even more critically for defense, advanced thermal imaging cameras and sensors.
So without germanium?
If you can't process germanium, you are effectively blind in modern low-light combat environments, and your entire communications network slows to a crawl.
And the last one you mentioned was antimony.
Antimony. While it's less glamorous, antimony is crucial for creating specialized alloys used in hardening munitions, specifically for making bullets and certain types of armor-piercing rounds.
So if we rely on China for the processing of antimony,
we are reliant on them for our basic ammunition supply. This is the economic kill switch that China is now demonstrating. By restricting the export of these specific low-volume, high-impact materials, they are proving a fundamental truth.
That the nation controlling the raw materials has more power than the nation printing the money.
Exactly. The U.S. military machine is literally built on a foundation of Chinese sand, and there is no software patch for the physical chemistry of the periodic table. You cannot print a gallium mine.
And you can't print the decades of expertise and infrastructure required to rebuild the refineries that were dismantled over the last 40 years.
Absolutely not. China is turning the dial slowly, not cutting everything off at once, but they're clearly demonstrating that they hold the key to the American war machine without firing a single missile. That is the grim industrial reality Washington is now waking up to.
And this fragility doesn't stop with the defense industry. The exact same vulnerability extends directly into the Western ambition for a green energy transition.
It's the same story. The source material points out that the entire transition, net zero, the Green New Deal, is failing because it was pursued without a corresponding materials transition. The West outsourced the dirty work, the mining, the refining, the manufacturing of components to China.
Which creates an immense strategic vulnerability. It turns an environmental goal into an economic trap.
And we are seeing this vulnerability manifest right now with the silver crisis. China is imposing new export restrictions on silver starting January 1st, requiring special government licenses for its movement.
Why silver? Why is that so crucial?
Silver is absolutely vital. It's used in high-tech chips, electric vehicles, and most significantly, it's a necessary component in virtually every solar panel manufactured globally. A lack of silver directly hinders the core technology of the renewable energy sector.
And the markets are reacting dramatically to this announcement.
They are. Prices have already surged, hitting $80 an ounce in London and even higher, reportedly up to $85 in China, which indicates massive domestic stockpiling efforts.
And this isn't just about their own domestic production, right?
No. China is strategically using the Belt and Road Initiative not just for infrastructure, but to secure global commodity supplies. They're specifically targeting silver deposits in regions like Peru and Chile, effectively locking up the non-Chinese supply chain, too.
So the strategic trap is perfectly set.
Perfectly. If tensions escalate, say, over Taiwan, which is an evergreen flashpoint, China could halt exports of solar components and silver. That would immediately stop the expansion of the U.S. green grid and cause electricity costs to skyrocket.
And the key takeaway here is that throwing money at the problem, like the hundreds of billions printed for the Inflation Reduction Act, isn't going to solve a physical geology deficit.
Exactly. The reliance on Beijing for survival in both the military and the energy sectors is not just political, it's physical. It's based on industrial capacity. This is the central conflict of the early 21st century.
Okay, that is a sobering look at economic self-sabotage and the new rules of geopolitical power. Now let's zoom out again. Because these crises, the military standoff, the supply chain chokehold, they aren't isolated accidents. They are symptoms of a much larger structural and philosophical conflict between two competing visions of global organization.
Yes, and this philosophical framework is crucial to understanding the deep forces at play. The sources frame the current geopolitical struggle as a clash between two fundamentally different philosophies of humanity and wealth creation.
On one side, you have the civilization of the sea.
Right. This system is centered historically on Wall Street and London. Its power is derived from controlling global trade routes, maintaining a giant military, especially the Navy, and focusing on financial arbitrage and credit systems. It inherently prioritizes capital mobility and financial returns over tangible production.
And crucially, the sources characterize this maritime system as one that inherently tends to underdevelop and impoverish the world's periphery.
Yeah, because it views the planet primarily as a source of cheap resources and labor for the financial centers. Philosophically, it is often premised on a Malthusian view, where human beings are a problem, a liability whose population and consumption must be managed, limited, and reduced to conserve resources for the elite.
Contrasting this is the civilization of the land,
which is often centered around Eurasia, the so-called world island, and embodied by the BRICS nations, particularly China and Russia. This alternative system views human beings as the ultimate source of wealth, their labor power, their innovation, their creativity.
So prioritizes collective vision and strategic investment in the population.
Exactly. Building roads, rail lines, connectivity across vast land masses, physical infrastructure development.
Now let's explicitly connect this philosophy back to part 2. It's the maritime empire philosophy, valuing finance over production, that led the U.S. to prioritize short-term profit and outsource the processing of materials like gallium and antimony.
That's the key insight. That philosophy created the very industrial fragility that the land civilization through China is now leveraging as its kill switch.
The sources even argue that the American story itself is an ongoing internal battle against this sea-based empire.
They do. The American Revolution was an internal struggle against British financial control. Even Abraham Lincoln's Civil War and his subsequent push for continental rail and industrial development, the American system, was historically cited as a struggle against the very financial and free trade tenets promoted by the British sea-based system.
But the sources contend that today, the current U.S. elites are criticized for treating America as just New York City and Southern California.
The financial and cultural coasts, yes. Attempting to collapse the U.S. into the global open international system rather than developing its potential as a true civilization of the land that invests in its heartland, its infrastructure, and its population.
So the foundational question for you, the listener, is whether the U.S. will remain a maritime civilization focused on global financial hegemony.
Or whether it will revert to its earlier potential, focusing inward on developing its industrial base and investing in its people. The sources see the current maritime-style system as deeply dysfunctional, precisely because its Malthusian view acts upon humanity as the problem, driving policies like de-industrialization and that harm rather than build up the population.
Speaking of global fault lines, let's transition to the Middle East, a region that is always ready to ignite. Netanyahu recently visited Trump, attempting to secure explicit support and aggressively selling the need for a major war with Iran.
The framing he used was particularly manipulative, designed to appeal to Trump's desire for legacy and strength. He framed the choice as Trump being remembered either for utterly destroying Hamas or for being outwitted by them.
So setting the stage for future conflict and humiliation.
It was a high-pressure attempt to force Trump's hand toward military action against Tehran. And this pressure is directly related to a core military concern: Iran's increasingly robust defense strategy.
They aren't just rebuilding, they are upgrading and integrating their missile capabilities.
And creating a dense, layered defense umbrella that Israel fears would render any preemptive strike against Iran's nuclear program completely ineffective.
What makes this strategy so difficult to counter?
It's the dispersion and the hardening of their assets. Iran's bases are deep underground, protected by multiple layers of rock and concrete, and they're spread across the entire country. This makes them highly resistant to conventional strikes, even by U.S. bunker-buster munitions.
But what is crucial to understand is Iran's primary strategic focus. It's often portrayed as an existential threat to Israel, but their military doctrine is primarily centered on something else.
Deterrence against the United States. Iran maintains thousands of drones and medium and short-range missiles directed specifically at the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, targeting the choke point of the Strait of Hormuz.
So if the U.S. were to engage in a major strike against Iran,
the immediate and likely response would be the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The sources are clear on the consequence. A major U.S.-Iran war would be very costly and would likely lead to the instantaneous end of the global economy due to the stoppage of critical oil and gas shipping lanes. The risk of economic catastrophe is enormous.
And Netanyahu's aggressive push for a green light is seen as an attempt to force the issue before Iran's deterrence capability becomes completely unassailable.
That's the analysis, yes.
And if the Middle East wasn't enough volatility, we must look at a rapidly developing flashpoint in South America, Venezuela.
Right. Sources reported, though U.S. officials did not publicly confirm, a U.S. strike on a dock area in Venezuela, allegedly where boats were loaded with drugs. Trump did later mention a major explosion in that dock area, which lends credence to the claim.
But the analysis provided in the sources characterized this strike not as being primarily about interdicting drugs.
No, or even about securing resources. It's seen as an attempt at classic old-school regime change to remove President Maduro. This action relies on the traditional U.S. model of low-signature intervention.
Using special forces and naval strikes, like tomahawks.
Exactly, rather than mobilizing a large, politically costly land invasion force.
And this regime change attempt dramatically raises the geopolitical stakes because of Venezuela's international alignment.
That's the key. Venezuela is actively on the road to joining the larger BRICS process, the bloc dedicated to creating an alternative to the Western financial system.
So when the U.S. undertakes such military action against a BRICS partner in waiting, it is immediately viewed by major global powers,
Russia, China, and Iran, as a dangerous, undeclared war by the U.S. against that emerging alternative global system. It commands close international attention and increases the risk of those powers intervening to support Maduro and solidify the BRICS presence in the Western Hemisphere.
So the U.S. is essentially opening a new front, challenging the multipolar world in its own backyard.
That's how it's being seen.
So we have the proxy war in Ukraine escalating, a global economic kill switch held by China, and now potential direct military engagement intended to halt the expansion of the BRICS system into South America. All of this chaos, we must now ask, may not be accidental.
And this final section analyzes how division, propaganda, and manufactured chaos are essential, deeply embedded tools used by elites to maintain control both domestically and abroad, especially when the underlying economic system is failing.
The thesis here is chilling, and it requires some historical context. Elites maintain power by actively fermenting political violence and chaos.
And the goal is twofold: to divide the public and to create demoralization and confusion among those who are genuinely unhappy with the economic system, people who feel they are working too much and not making enough money.
So when people are angry, the goal of the elites is to ensure they focus that anger on their neighbors, the other side of the political aisle, instead of organizing a united front against the elites or the economic structure itself.
Exactly. And this strategy has a deep historical parallel cited in the source material: the decades-long years of lead in Italy from the 1960s to the 1980s.
We should probably define what this was. This period of political and societal unrest saw numerous bombings and terrorist attacks.
Yes, and the theory, which is often associated with investigations into Operation Gladio, is that this chaos was engineered from above. Operation Gladio was a secret, post-World War II, NATO-linked, stay-behind paramilitary network
Designed to resist a potential Soviet invasion.
Right. But the sources suggest that elements within Gladio, allegedly connected to the CIA and Italian intelligence, manipulated and armed both far-left and far-right groups, staging terrorist attacks to subdue popular opposition and ensure Italy remained firmly within NATO's orbit.
And the outcome of that manipulation was devastating, but politically effective.
It was. NATO won by default because the Italian public became too confused, demoralized, and terrified to engage politically or critically examine the status quo. This allowed the unpopular ruling class to remain in power. The violence was intentionally fermented from above to prevent mass movements, like the powerful Communist Party at the time, from fundamentally challenging the system.
Applied to modern American politics, the concept is that violence and division are being engineered from above.
Correct. The controversy surrounding the death of high-profile political figures, for instance, is highlighted as an example where the media narrative is carefully managed to ensure that, quote, the left and the right are either celebrating each other's murder or think the other side wants to murder them.
And the primary motive cited for fermenting this internal chaos is to prevent any form of cross-ideological unity, especially around major foreign policy issues.
That's the worst nightmare for the status quo elites. If the culturally conservative right and the progressive left were to unite on critical issues, say ending foreign wars, challenging U.S. support for Israel, or opposing corporate outsourcing, that collective challenge is what they fear most.
So creating high drama violence and fear ensures both sides focus their anger horizontally on each other instead of vertically on the system's elites.
And this strategy of manufactured division is powerfully reinforced by deep-seated information warfare, particularly through historical and relentless anti-Russian sentiment, or Russophobia.
Russophobia is certainly not a recent invention tied to the Ukraine conflict. Its roots trace back nearly a millennium to the 11th century schism between the Orthodox and Catholic churches.
Right. And after the collapse of the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century, much of the anti-Byzantine propaganda was strategically transferred and directed toward Russia, positioning it as the eternal, uncivilized other of the West.
This narrative has manifested historically in some bizarre and aggressive ways.
Very much so. We see Napoleon using a fake document, the infamous Testament of Peter the Great in 1812, to justify a preemptive attack on Russia. Later in the 19th century, British media frequently portrayed czars as demonic figures, often referencing vampire or Dracula tropes, to generate public fear and support imperial policies against Russia.
Today, that deeply historical bias is repackaged.
It's repackaged into the familiar framework of liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. This binary serves as a convenient and emotionally charged placeholder for the good guys versus bad guys division, which facilitates unquestioning support for accepted Western policy lines regarding Ukraine, sanctions, and NATO expansion.
And this narrative creates an environment of enforced intellectual orthodoxy, where dissent is actively suppressed. We see instances of Western leaders in media demonstrating a grotesque misunderstanding of military reality.
Like one UK expert claiming on air that Putin is confused and Ukraine is doing very well, even as the battlefield reality shows rapid Russian advances.
And it's more concerning how this orthodoxy is enforced in Europe.
Oh, yes. Sources detail the active sanctioning and ghosting of Swiss and European citizens, including established journalists and academics who dare to question the approved narrative or propose solutions that might be favorable to Russia, such as acknowledging NATO's historical role in the conflict's genesis.
This highlights that even fact-based discussions are instantly castigated as conspiracy theories if they contradict the simple good guys versus bad guys framing.
Discussions like the documented involvement of NATO countries in supporting the toppling of the Ukrainian government in 2004 and 2014, or the U.S. taking control of Ukrainian intelligence services to make them a proxy. These are treated as off-limits. The goal is not winning the argument, but eliminating the debate entirely.
The final pressure point in this domestic chaos strategy is the immense sensitivity surrounding the issue of Israel in U.S. politics. This acts as another tool of control used to enforce conformity.
We see this exemplified in the ongoing controversy surrounding commentator Ben Shapiro and the USS Liberty incident.
So the debate centers on Shapiro dismissing the 1967 Israeli attack on the USS Liberty as irrelevant.
Right, which killed dozens of American servicemen and wounded many more. Critics argue that this position is not just a historical interpretation, but a tool used to justify eternal support for Israel by deeming any uncomfortable historical facts irrelevant if they conflict with the singular pro-Israel stance required by the U.S. status quo.
His argument implies that facts from 1967 are as irrelevant as citing World War II events to define current relations.
A clear attempt to neutralize dissenting historical facts. And furthermore, we see this sensitivity fueling bizarre public feuds between high-profile right-wing media figures. The recent strange public attack by Alex Jones on Candace Owens, calling her a CIA deep state agent, is widely viewed through the lens of external elite pressure.
Pressure to combat what?
Jones allegedly received pressure to combat the rising tide of the woke right, a group often characterized as culturally conservative but increasingly skeptical and opposed to unlimited U.S. support for Israel. This is the exact type of cross-ideological fracture the elites fear.
So Jones's attack, using the very deep state accusations usually aimed at the left, was used to delegitimize a prominent conservative voice who dared to question the foreign policy consensus.
Precisely. It illustrates the immense political capital invested in maintaining a unified pro-Israel stance among influential media and political circles. They are willing to use information warfare tactics, like accusing dissenters of being deep state operatives, to prevent any significant challenge to the foreign policy status quo. The issue is so sensitive that it's driving intense division even among traditional conservative allies, showing the power of the manufactured chaos tactic.
So the central dilemma for the American political system is now laid bare.
Yes, the foreign policy establishment is operating with a grotesque misunderstanding of reality, believing they have leverage over Russia, or that the U.S. industrial base is secure, while simultaneously the system's elites are using tactics of manufactured chaos, reminiscent of Operation Gladio, to prevent any populist cross-ideological challenge to their rule.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as we step into 2026?
Well, the sources reveal a profound and potentially fatal disconnect for the U.S. system. The nation is caught between internal political warfare, where elements of the deep state actively undermine the sitting president's diplomatic efforts, and external geopolitical realities, where Russia is militarily winning and China is leveraging its control over critical supply chains.
Essentially holding the structural fate of the U.S. in its hands.
That's right. The key vulnerabilities are structural and they're interlocking. China holds the kill switch over U.S. industry, relying on specific material dependencies like gallium and antimony. Meanwhile, Trump faces immense difficulty pushing for a rational peace because his own intelligence community, neoconservatives, and traditional elites oppose any concessions.
They prefer to escalate or prolong the conflict, even if it guarantees the eventual collapse of U.S. strategic interests.
The system appears to be in an existential crisis. It's facing external collapse due to decades of industrial neglect and financialization, while simultaneously suffering from internal rot due to engineered political division, designed to keep the citizenry fighting each other rather than demanding accountability from the elites.
Absolutely. The picture is one of simultaneous erosion on all fronts, driven by a philosophy that values short-term finance over long-term industrial capability and population investment. We've documented the financialization of America leading directly to the collapse of its industrial capacity.
And we've also documented the historical parallel of U.S. intelligence agencies utilizing years of lead-style tactics, like Operation Gladio, to manipulate domestic politics and prevent popular leaders from achieving systemic change.
This leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to consider. Given this simultaneous failure, where is the greatest and most immediate danger to the American system coming from?
Is it the collapse of the external economy? The China kill switch and resource warfare, which threatens to paralyze the U.S. military and energy sectors? Or is it the orchestrated chaos of the internal political climate, designed to keep the citizenry divided, demoralized, and politically inert, guaranteeing the continuation of the elite status quo, regardless of the economic cost?
Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.